So we're going to talk about now some public policy issues specifically. And again, like I said earlier, the four that I was requested to talk on are self-defense, the right to self-defense. Is there a biblical basis for the right to self-defense? And then we'll talk about abortion in light of Scripture. Then we're going to talk about education, some basic principles for education. And then we'll talk about foreign policy. And these talks may be varying in length, just depending on how much you guys want to engage. Because again, I'm not going to try to get too nuanced on specific policy recommendations. I'm merely going to be laying out some biblical principles, and then we can do Q&A if you're interested, or we'll just speed through to the next session. Again, there are 4 sessions, so no need to belabor the point on any one that's not particularly interesting to this audience. So we'll start off with the right to self-defense. So I think first and foremost, again, I'll just say right now, I'm not a pacifist. There are many Christians who are, and I understand to a degree where they're coming from. I think Ecclesiastes 3, 1-8 offers some good wisdom on this. It says, there is an appointed time for everything, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. So again, it's not so much that, I think there are times where we need to fight hard for peace. We need to say, this is not the time to kill, this is not the time for war. But we live in a fallen world, and so there are times where killing and war are necessary. So hopefully we can put together some principles to kind of know better about that. Obviously, there are some objections to this, and I'll share them. First of all, the big one is in the 10 Commandments. It literally reads, thou shalt not kill. That's the literal Hebrew there, is not kill. So some would say, well, that's pretty clear. We should never kill, right? Well, again, it's important to take Scripture and its yes, sir.
So you use the interpretation or the Scripture of thou shalt not kill, or many translations say thou shalt not murder, which is quite different than simply kill.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And many translations do that to avoid the confusion because, again, the literal Hebrew word used there is to kill. So the most literal word for word translation would be thou shalt not kill. However, as I'm about to say, if you look in the context of Scripture, what it's really saying there is you shall not kill in an illegitimate manner. Okay? Just like Genesis 9:6 is the verse here, says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. So that's clearly saying in an aggressive, attacking, unjustified manner going to kill someone. It's not saying if someone goes off to war and kills someone in combat, I guess we need to kill that soldier. No. Someone, now we'll talk about the examples of when it's legitimate to do that. So I'm saying is people will take that verse and say, oh, well, that's what it's saying, but they don't look at the rest of Scripture to provide context on that statement. But yes, you're absolutely right. There are many that translate it, thou shalt not murder, just to avoid any confusion because of the context of Scripture. Because it can be translated that as well. It's just not the most literal, basic meaning of that Hebrew word. So again, here's a command directly from God that came even before the 10 Commandments were given that makes it very clear that there is a place for shedding someone's blood, for killing someone, if it's in discipline for someone else committing murder. Also, we see an example in Genesis 14:14. Abram, obviously, one of the great patriarchs of the Old Testament. When Abram heard that his relative, that is Lot, had been taken captive, he led out his trained men born in his house, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. In fact, there was a battle fought, and very likely lives were taken, people were slain. We see many obviously other examples of this throughout the Old Testament. David, obviously, he killed Goliath. He fought in battles and was a great warrior of the Lord, and he was well honored for that, even by God. He was a man after God's own heart for a lot of that. So clearly there's a place for it. Another example is, Jesus said in Matthew 5:38-39, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. So some would say, well, that's fine in the Old Testament, there was that. But now in the New Testament, Jesus is a pacifist. We're not supposed to ever show any kind of resistance to a person who's attacking us. And they'll even point to, so if Jesus is saying here, if someone punches you in the face, you should just turn to him the other side and say, punch that one as well. Well, that's actually not what this is talking about. The idea of slapping someone in this cultural context is more the idea of insulting, like a public insult or humiliation. It's basically saying, it's okay. Take the humiliation. This is not talking about a physical assault where the guy's trying to kill you or severely harm you or a loved one. And in fact, Jesus also, using an analogy in Luke 11:21, talks about when a strong man, fully armed, so he had weaponry, guards his own house, his possessions are secure. So he acknowledges the virtues of having not only a right to self-defense, but being armed and prepared. And here's the third objection, obviously, that people use to point to the passivity of Jesus, saying in Matthew 26, "And behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached, and drew out his sword, and struck the slave of the high priest, and cut off his ear." This is Peter when one of the servants came to arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." Again, we shouldn't take this out of its context. For example, Jesus says in Matthew 26, "So do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way?" Again, Jesus is saying, look, I have incredible military force at that legions, that's a military term. I have incredible force at my disposal that I can use whenever I want. So clearly God does not believe in not having an ability to self-defend. And furthermore, we see in Luke 22, this is, I think, even more clear. It says, "And he," that is Jesus, "said to them," that is his disciples, "But now whoever has a money belt is to take it along, likewise also a bag, and whoever has no sword is to sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this which is written must be fulfilled in me." And he was counted with wrongdoers, for that which refers to me has its fulfillment. So again, he's, if what he was saying to Peter, and whoever lives by the sword shall die by the sword, in a way that if we interpret that as saying, oh, Jesus thinks we should never bear the sword, well, clearly he's contradicting himself when he tells his disciples to buy a sword if they don't have one. And why should they buy one? Well, because they're going to be affiliated with Jesus, and it says, "And he," that is Jesus, "was counted with wrongdoers." So in other words, he's saying, look, you're going to be hated in the world. You should have some means of self-protection with you. That's a prudent thing to do. What he was telling Peter in the garden was simply that, look, this is not the time for this. This is God's will that I be arrested and taken to the slaughter here. This is not the time to be doing this. Obviously, we see that there's a role for government in bearing the sword as well. Romans 13:4 says, "But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. For it is a servant of God, an avenger, who brings wrath on the one who practices evil." We see more of this, and this is kind of a balance to the government's role. Obviously, so we can infer from Romans 13, chapter 13, verse 4, that God's design is that government is primarily the one who bears the sword and avenges acts of evil. And so, as much as possible, we should appeal to the governing authorities to be the ones who use force in countering evil, as opposed to just taking matters into our own hands. However, just like Jesus told his disciples to take a sword with them, there are examples where government is simply not able to get there in time. And a great example of this is if someone's breaking into your house, for example, right, and threatening you. Exodus 22, 2-3 talks about this. It says, "If the thief is caught while breaking in and is struck, presumably by the housekeeper, the person in the house, so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltiness on his account." That is, the person who is defending his house and happens to kill the thief is not going to be guilty. He's not at fault for killing him. So in other words, he's in some ways justified for using violent force in that context. "He shall surely make restitution." So again, there's a case where there are times when the government's not going to be there, and that apparently it's justified that we use it if we're being attacked in our own home by an invader. Now, with that said, let me preface that with, I'm not sure about the laws in this state, but I know that there are some little nuances with when you can use lethal force and when you can't, even when you're being robbed. And I think in many cases it's only if there's threat to your life or serious injury to you or a loved one are you allowed to use lethal force. If someone's just breaking in to steal something, again, there are different laws on how that works. So don't leave here and then go, God forbid your house gets robbed tonight and you shoot the guy and kill him and you get, punished by the law for it. Don't go there and say, "Oh, well, Samuel at church told me I should do this," okay? Just don't misunderstand me. All I'm saying is this passage is, and this was Israel's law too, but all I'm saying is that there's clearly, in God's eyes, because it still reflects his nature, his moral law is still reflected here. So clearly in God's eyes, it's not wrong for us to defend ourselves using force when we're being robbed in our house, for example. That's all I'm saying. The exact details of how that plays out, I encourage you to study the laws of your local area and try to follow those as best you can. But that's simply the point I'm making here, so please don't misunderstand me. We also see an example here of even, you could say, open carry or in the Bible. Nehemiah 4:14, and then verses 18 and 23, I'll say, do not be afraid of them, that is, these enemies of the people who were rebuilding Jerusalem. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. So there's that idea of self-defense, defending your family and even your house, your possession. Each wore his sword girded at his side as he built. Each took his weapon, even to the water. Again, that idea of self-defense, even carrying it around on your person, as clearly has a place in Scripture. And again, I don't think you can take this passage and say, you know, we must have open carry, yada, yada. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. All I'm simply saying is that that concept is clearly not against. God does not have a problem with that concept because his own people did it in this context of self-defense. And again, it's reaffirming that idea that there is a duty for us, especially as men, to be protecting our families and even our possessions, even with weaponry. And I think a good example of this is we've alluded to this several times in 1 Kings 12-14. There's an example here of there is a place not only, I think this appeals to really the Second Amendment, beyond just defending our persons from a robber or a murderer or someone who's trying to inflict, an individual who's trying to inflict harm on us. I think, again, there's a place where having weaponry can be useful even in resisting tyranny, right? Like the colonists certainly did against the King of England, and they enshrined in the Second Amendment to the Constitution. They said the security of a free people. So the idea of the free people is like our security against a tyrannical government, is another way of wording it, is contingent upon there being a well-regulated militia, and therefore the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. For the people to bear arms, to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. So again, for the sake of our security as a deterrent against tyrannical government, us having weaponry can be useful in a form of self-defense. So this example in 1 Kings 12-14, this is what Rehoboam said to the people of Israel when he became king. He said, my father, that is referring to Solomon, made your yoke heavy with taxation. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. And in response to this, the people of Israel said, well, what share do we have in David, and what part in Jesse's son? To your tents, Israel, look after your own house, David. When all the Israelites heard then that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to an assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained under the house of David. So again, there's this idea of political separation. And in fact, and you see here the separation between Jeroboam was the northern kingdom and Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, remained in the southern kingdom of Judah. Rehoboam was like, well, I'm going to call out the military and go in and crush this political separation. And Jeroboam and his people would have taken up arms in self-defense. So there's that idea of having self-defense against tyranny. And God himself here said to Rehoboam, said, do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. And later on, a prophet was told to go to tell Jeroboam what God said, saying, I, that is God, raised you up from among the people and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. So again, this idea that there's clearly a place in Scripture for self-defense against tyrannical rule in the form of political separation. So really, what are some bottom line takeaways, some principles we can take from these Scriptures? Well, first of all, a government that recognizes the right, that protects the right to self-defense, they affirm the sanctity of human life, right? Like we said, Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. And so the idea of using force, even lethal force in defense or even in avenging the loss of a human life, it's important because it recognizes the sanctity of that human life as an image bearer of God. Secondly, it can help the government more effectively accomplish its mission of punishing evil as an avenger, right? Like we were talking about the example, if you're in your house and someone's breaking in, you often don't have time to call 911 and the police to get there in time. If you have to, you'll use your whatever means you have at your disposal to protect yourself and your loved ones from this intruder. And so that's a way that by the government allowing for that in their society, they're better able to not only punish evil and avenge it in the immediate sense, but even deter it, right? Because if it's proven over and over again, if a robber knows that you have a gun or say a big mean dog in your house or your yard or something like that, they're much less likely to try to go and pick your house as someone that they know doesn't have that in their house. So again, it can help deter evil, not only avenge it, but deter it. And ultimately, also, when they allow the people to arm themselves, they're acknowledging that they're not above the law. They're saying, okay, we realize that the government can sometimes overstep its bounds, and it's important that we have that check, that restraint within our own population to discourage us from becoming tyrannical. And history is filled with examples, filled with cases of governments ranging from Nazi Germany to communist China, see Soviet Russia, same thing, many other cases of dictators rising to power, taking away the right to own firearms, and then in the immediate aftermath, horrible genocides and other acts of brutal tyranny followed. So those are the principles I had to share. Does anyone have any questions or comments? And again, that's a nuance, right? I mean, it's a nuance. Where do you draw the line? What is allowed, what is not? Especially in our day where weaponry is so advanced. I don't have a comment on the extreme things, like say tanks or aircraft, fighter jets and things like that. I mean, obviously to even be able to purchase those, you have to have a special security clearance or special contract with the private contractors that sell those. So, I mean, even aside from laws, it's hard to get. As far as like, should you own a semi-automatic or an automatic rifle? I personally, given the, and this is even outside of just say the Bible, but like just the Second Amendment, which is the law of our land, the highest power, it very much implies that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to secure the freedom of the people from tyrannical government overreach. It's very clear that's really the point there. So I would say that they should be allowed. Now, if individual states want to regulate, who has access to that or how it's stored, et cetera, I don't have a problem with the state government doing that. I don't want the federal government regulating it, but I'm okay with state governments regulating that stuff. I don't want any government regulating it. And I totally understand that. I'm simply saying from a constitutional perspective, I think that I think that Second Amendment as originally written was restraining the U.S. government, the federal government, from regulating it. Individual states can have their own laws that they choose. And again, I'm all for laws that say, if you allow a minor to access these weapons, or you irresponsibly store them, or something like that, obviously you should be held liable under the law of any consequences that result. Or even, and again, like if you sell guns to a known criminal and they go and shoot up a school, whoever sold those guns to that known criminal, and by that I mean like someone who has a previous demonstration of violence or a disregard for the law. Again, I'm all for laws that, enforce responsible gun selling. But again, those are just my opinions. That's not biblical per se. I'm just offering my opinion. And I understand people will agree and disagree on both sides of that equation. So.
They had several cases through the Supreme Court now about responsibilities of police departments.
Right. Right.
You've got a family, you better be ready, willing, and able to protect your family because nobody else is going to protect you.
Right, and you're absolutely right. In fact, government's role, even under Scripture, Romans 13, they're an avenger. They're not necessarily a protector. I think we often misconstrue that. Government's job is not to protect the people. Its job is to avenge acts of violence against its people, especially in the context of the police. I mean, we don't have guards, we don't have police officers stationed at our doorpost to keep out burglars. They're on 911 call if someone is breaking the law and breaking in. And certainly they can investigate suspicious situations, but they can't actually enforce anything until there's a crime committed. So yeah, who's on it to actually protect? It's us to protect ourselves. You're absolutely right.
Seeing people defending themselves, being taken to court,
I completely agree. Yeah, I completely agree.
trying to prosecute them, it's terrifying.
Right, and I personally have issue with laws that say if someone is invading your house, even if they're not attacking you physically, if they're breaking into your home at night, for whatever reason, I don't think you should ever be prosecuted for shooting them. Just my personal view.
How would they expect you to decipher that? You
Right.
carry on a conversation.
Right. It's like, what, you're going to wait till they're on top of you, beating you, and at that point, it's too late to pull your gun and shoot the guy. So yeah, no, I'm all for, I think someone breaks into your house, it's fair game at that point because they're invading your personal space. But again, different states have different laws. So again, don't take my opinions or even a Bible verse that I quoted as justification, do that, and then blame it on the Bible or me when you get taken to court for it. I'm just going to leave it at that. Anyone else have anything they want to share? Okay, great. Well, does anyone want to take a break, or should I just move on to the next